Hi, everyone. Welcome to the WiDS Datathon 2025 panel on women's brain health. I'm Valerie Elliott, a program director here at WiDS Worldwide. And at WiDS, we empower women in data science by providing access to programs, content, and resources that inspire, educate, and support their growth. Our mission is to elevate their contributions while fostering a strong and collaborative community. This week is Brain Awareness Week, which is a perfect time to highlight the significant gaps in research and data on women's brain health. Despite advances in neuroscience, women remain largely understudied, which lead to misdiagnosis and treatments that don't fully account for the female brain. In today's panel, we're going to dive into why representation in brain health data matters. We'll explore how conditions like ADHD present differently in women, the importance of studying sex-specific brain health across the lifespan, and how this data is used in practice. Our goal is to raise awareness, spark discussion, and highlight the impact that better data can have on healthcare and lives. This conversation today is very relevant because we are in the middle of this year's WiDS Datathon challenges in partnership with Ann S. Bauer's Women's Brain Health Initiative, Cornell University, UC Santa Barbara, and the Child Mind Institute. These challenges analyze demographic, diagnostic, and fMRI data to better understand the female brain. We are really excited today to have an incredible panel of experts hosted by Ariana Zunazi, Amy Kuzieski, and Nina Molan. There will first be a 1-hour panel discussion, followed by 30 minutes of Q&A, where we invite all of you to submit your questions in the YouTube chat for the panelists. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to pass it to the hosts to each introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I'm Ariana Zuanazzi, and I work at the Child Mind Institute, which is an independent nonprofit that is focused on transforming the lives of children and families who experience mental health and learning disorders. And we do that through science, education, and care. My role as CMI is to lead open science initiatives, driving data sharing initiatives and efforts, as well as fostering collaborative research partnership.
My name is Amy Kuzieski. I'm a professor at Weill Cornell Radiology and the Computational Biology Department at Cornell Ithaca. And I'm also the co-director of the AI Core for the Ann S. Bauer's Women's Brain Health Initiative. And this Women's Brain Health Initiative is really what we're the focus of that WBHI is to shed light on women's brain health. And this is driven largely by the lack of knowledge. So one thing I wanted to follow up on Valerie's beautiful comments at the beginning, a statistic for you is out of the tens of thousands of neuroscience studies in the past several years, only 0.5% of them have focused on something that is specific to women's bodies. So I think that there's a lot of room for us to all make an impact, and we at the WBHI are trying to do that as well. So thank you all for joining us today.
Nina Molan, also super excited to be here. I'm a professor of AI at UC Santa Barbara, and with Amy, co-director of AI for the Ann S. Bauer's Women's Brain Health Initiative. And I'm very interested in how we can use machine learning and AI to accelerate the pace of discoveries in women's brain health, because we are decades behind what we should be in terms of what we know on the women's brain. And as Valerie and Amy said, the problem is that we don't have much data. So could the algorithm be improved in order to be able to make discovery from these small data sets? So that's what my research is about.
Awesome. Amy, I'll let you start with our panelists.
Yeah, so we would love for each of the panelists to take a turn and introduce yourselves as well, and then answer the question, what is one thing you love about where you live? So I'll go in the order of the little Zoom windows. So Rebecca, you're first.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Newhouse. Thank you so much for having me. I am a pediatric neuropsychologist, and I also work at the Child Mind Institute with Ariana. And I am the clinical manager of the Healthy Brain Network study, and I will be telling you a little bit more about that later. That's one of my questions. And I manage the clinical part of the Healthy Brain Network, where we provide comprehensive evaluations to children across the tri-state area. And one thing I really enjoy about where I live, I am lucky enough to live in New York City, in Manhattan, 2 blocks away from Central Park. So having Central Park as my backyard is very exciting and something I never get tired of. So I would say that's the thing I enjoy most about living in New York City.
Great, thank you so much. Up next, we have disclaimer, my niece, Natalie Williams.
Hi, I'm Natalie Williams. I'm 18 years old and I'm a senior at Horseheads High School. I was diagnosed with ADHD and it was a pretty difficult journey to get there. So I'm happy to share my story. I'm also really excited to follow in my aunt's footsteps and research neuroscience in college and everything. So I hope that I can share my story and also learn a few things while I'm here. So thank you.
Awesome, great. Next up, we have Dr. Tim Silk.
Hi, I'm Tim Silk. I'm a professor in psychology at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia, and part of the Centre of Social and Early Emotional Development. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, so I use neuroimaging techniques to try and understand the brain and how it develops, and how it relates to cognition. Being in Australia, we've just come to the end of summer, so I'm really enjoying the nice warm weather at the moment, and enjoying the ocean swims down at the beach.
Oh, I'm jealous. Okay. Next up, we have Emily Rosenthal.
So my name is Emily Rosenthal. I am a doctoral candidate at UC Berkeley in clinical science. So I work with Dr. Steve Henshaw, and my work uses both qualitative and quantitative methods to look at ADHD across the lifespan. And I'm particularly interested in kind of developmental transitions that can be really tough for everyone. So adolescence, kind of the transition to young adulthood, as well as specifically the experiences of girls and women. So I live in Berkeley, California, and so the weather is beautiful, and there's also a lot of really nice like walking and hiking and running trails, and so I enjoy going out on some of those.
Thank you so much. All right, so up first, we have Ariana.
Yeah, so I'm very excited to kick off this panel with Rebecca. Rebecca and I work together on a daily basis, and Rebecca is not only a great colleague, but is also a very generous and nice person. So I'm really excited to be here with her. So Rebecca, our first question for you is, what do you think are some of the ongoing barriers to early ADHD identification, and in particular in girls?
Yes, so this is a question that we confront often at the Healthy Brain Network, because getting evaluated is such, can be really expensive and complicated for families. And so our initiative actually gives these evaluations for free. So we're oftentimes seeing families who have not been able to find services and have maybe been struggling with their children's mental health for a long time. So we see, many barriers to identifying ADHD, especially in women. We see that, girls who present with ADHD a little bit differently. So the actual symptoms may look different. So girls are much more likely to present with the inattentive symptoms of ADHD rather than the hyperactive impulsive symptoms of ADHD. And when you look at the inattentive symptoms, they are much more likely to go under the radar. So things like, tuning out or getting distracted or struggling to pay attention. So these are things that could really interfere with your learning, but may not be as recognizable or noticeable in the classroom. So that, that different presentation is definitely one barrier. And that leads to, another issue is that part of the diagnostic criteria for ADHD is that we need to see the impairment across settings. So a lot of times what I see with girls with ADHD is that the parents and the person themselves will recognize that they're really struggling, but they're not getting that confirmation from teachers per se. And part of that could be because of what I mentioned before, that, the girls are not going to be the ones necessarily like getting up out of their seat and running around the classroom and causing trouble. Understandably, teachers, have a large class of kids, and they are going to end up being more concerned about the people who are being more disruptive and may not, necessarily be causing as many problems. So that kind of not getting that confirmation from teachers, and teachers are oftentimes the ones that refer people for evaluations, can also be another barrier. Then we also see that, girls may have less impairment, especially in the younger years. And that could be because, it's possible that girls have some nice compensatory strategies and pro-social skills that help them overcome a lot of the challenges, which is great. Compensation is great, except we know that sometimes compensatory strategies can come at a cost. So we know if you have to work much harder to pay attention and keep focused and, do well in school, that can put you at risk for, anxiety or depression. So, if there is no impairment, that's great, but we have to look and see if there's these signs of, maybe masking or compensatory strategies that could be causing problems in other area, when really the core is ADHD, and we would need to treat the ADHD to really get at the issue. And then there is some evidence about later onset of symptoms in girls. And the way that the diagnostic criteria work is that you actually have to present with symptoms before age 12. So that is, part of a larger issue that, the way that the diagnostic criteria work, it could be that they're not as sensitive to picking up ADHD in girls. And, then the last piece that I want to discuss as, being a possible barrier is something we call diagnostic overshadowing, which is that girls are much more likely also to have anxiety and depression. And if there's anxiety and depression there, that is going to overshadow a lot of the ADHD. And, part of that is, cultural and societal expectations that, if a girl, walks into a clinic, there are different, there are conceptions and biases that we all have of what could be causing the issue. So we're more likely to think that, a boy has ADHD, and we're more likely to think that, it's more anxiety or depression for girls. And, I think women do have, true higher biological rates of anxiety and depression, but we want to make sure that we're really screening for this. And sometimes, anxiety can really look like ADHD, and we don't want to misdiagnose anxiety as ADHD, but we also want to take into account that these things are often very comorbid with each other, and really look closely that there may have been ADHD all along underlying this, and that's something that needs to be looked at closely also.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Something that you mentioned before about, the referral system and how, parents can refer their kids, or teachers can refer the kids to clinicians. I'm curious about that in the context of the Healthy Brain Network. As Valerie was mentioning before, we have this amazing Datathon that is ongoing, and this Datathon uses data from the Healthy Brain Network, which is what you focus on for your job, for your work. So could you tell us a bit more about this initiative and why this is a special initiative, especially in New York City, which is where it is based in? Thanks.
For sure. So the Healthy Brain Network is really, landmark research study with the goal of collecting data from 10,000 children across the tri-state area. And really, we've had participants across the US. It's really unique because we are this combination of both a research study and a clinical service provider. So, our research goals are creating this, big database that can study a lot of different questions related to mental health. The original stated goal of the study was to find biological markers of mental health. But as Ariana mentioned, we're an open science initiative, which means that we have regular data releases, and we've already had, studies done by researchers around the world, hundreds of studies looking at all different questions related to looking at our brain imaging data, all the way to looking at nonverbal learning disorders or, processing speed, or, there's no limit to the questions that could be studied by our database. Our database is extremely comprehensive. So we collect a lot of phenotypic data that includes like IQ testing and cognitive and language and social emotional assessments, and information related to the diagnosis of all of the families that we see, different like fitness data, and we actually also have the kids wear actigraphs, so we have the actigraphy data. So it's pretty amazing the the range of questions that could be asked, and then also using big data, the power of big numbers just lets you answer a lot more questions. So for example, a lot of studies using brain imaging are often, 10 or 12 or, 13 cases, and the types of questions you could answer using, looking at thousands of brain images are just much more powerful. So the science side of the Healthy Brain Network is really exciting. And then, the clinical side, which is the side that I'm more involved in, is that we provide these, no-cost comprehensive evaluations to families with the intended goal of really helping families get services. In New York, in particular, it's a very big issue that you actually need a diagnosis and evaluation to get any type of support in school. And these evaluations can very regularly go from anywhere between $5,000 and $10,000. So as you can imagine, that cost would really be prohibitive for large segments of the population. So, our clinical goal is really to make these evaluations more accessible, and to give families this really comprehensive report that they can then use as a tool to advocate for services, learn about their child. And then we also have a large referral network database where we provide referrals. We try to provide referrals that are accessible for the family, that are in their location, so that they can get the support that they need.
Thank you. I always love hearing and talking about the Healthy Brain Network. I think it's a great initiative. It has many aspects that are interesting for many different stakeholders. So that's also an aspect that I really enjoy about that. On top of having really an amazing team. So I also love to work with the Healthy Brain Network team. And my last question for you is, what is an aspect of your job that you really enjoy and makes your job feel unique?
So I have to pick two things. I couldn't settle on just
Please.
one. So one, I would say, I really enjoy having the feedback sessions with families where we get to go through all the results, because I think a lot of times families come into our study not knowing what to expect, and they're participating in research and it's free, and they're always blown away by the comprehensive report and how much they end up learning about their child, and and just, finally having the information that they've been seeking for so long. So I, never get tired of that part of my job. And then the other part that's really exciting is that we, like you mentioned, we have such a great team here, a multidisciplinary team of psychologists and social workers, and also research assistants who we work with. And those research assistants are oftentimes early in their career and, and applying to grad school. So I really appreciate the opportunity to, to mentor them and work with them at this stage when, when they're deciding what path they want to take.
Yeah, these are great aspects, and thank you so much. These were also very insightful answers, and I'm very happy to be here with you, Rebecca, today, and thank you so much. So next, I'll hand it over to Nina and Natalie.
Thank you, Ariana. And yeah, thank you, Rebecca. It was very unique to be able to hear this perspective of a clinician diagnosing ADHD and maybe the barriers to this diagnosis of ADHD in girls. Today, we're very fortunate because we are joined by Natalie, who has been diagnosed with ADHD. And so, Natalie, I was wondering if you were able to share a little bit about your journey to being diagnosed with ADHD.
Yeah, of course. Rebecca kind of just built every barrier that I had to go through. So, since basically daycare, I have shown signs of just not really being able to pay attention and not really being able to kind of sit down and focus on one task. But I guess my parents always were just like, oh, she's just a little daydreamy. Like she just, she's a girl. She's just thinking about other things. But they never really thought it was an issue just because I never really was running around the classroom or doing anything disruptive. Grades were, even from the beginning, very important to me. So I was able to adapt and never really had an issue in school per se. I was very talkative, very outgoing. So everyone just saw that as, oh, like such positive traits, which they were, like they make my personality. But by the time we went into COVID, it really hit me because I had to be on a computer for 6 hours and I was in middle school and I had no idea how to just sit down and just listen to a teacher talk for hours and hours and hours and just doing all this stuff on the computer. And I just never could focus on it for that long. And it kind of started to affect my grades. And I just started to complain a little bit more about being like, I can sit down and I understand the work, but I just can't focus on it. Like I can't get it done in the time it's supposed to be done. And it kind of started to hit me then. So that was when my parents decided that maybe we should go and get things checked out. And she asked my teachers, and they never had anything really bad to say. They were like, no, she's such a good student. Like she's always sweet. She's always doing her work. Like she's good. And so they never really had that thought of, oh, maybe there's something wrong until I started to get worse grades and started to, develop other things like anxiety and depression. And I was just really struggling. So when we finally did go to the doctor and they had a sheet with all of the questions about how I was feeling and how I was reacting, my mother was just like, yep, she does that. Yep, she does that. And it kind of started to click that, yes, I was very daydreamy and I couldn't seem to do a task. She'd have to remind me about 6 times to clean my room. And that wasn't because I was rebelling. It was because I just genuinely would forget each time. But finally going to the doctor was wonderful. And it was great to finally talk to a doctor that knew what was going on and could help me. But still, the getting something that would help me, like the medication and everything, seemed to be an even longer road with trying to find something that really worked for me. But I thought it was great to finally kind of realize that I wasn't just struggling like everyone else was during COVID. I was struggling because there was something wrong and it's something that I could potentially fix. So that was kind of my journey.
Thank you so much for sharing. And yes, I hadn't thought about how COVID in particular could impact people diagnosed with ADHD. I think, yeah, it's very powerful that you shared that bit of your story. And I'm also shocked that, as early as maybe daycare, there were signs, but somehow you got diagnosed so much later. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Now in the present, did you find a way to kind of accommodate this ADHD? And could you share maybe how ADHD impacts your life today, both in negative but also maybe in positive ways?
Yeah, I was on medication for a long time and it worked pretty well, but there was some issues with other medication that I was taking, so I ended up going off of it for a while. And I'm going to have to get back on it by college, most likely. But it did seem to help when I did take it, especially when we were doing half online and half in school is when I really needed it, and it really started to help me because I could finally sit down and just actually focus on everything. ADHD has been positive because I've been able to meet people that also have ADHD and kind of be like, oh, like you do this too. And especially during COVID, a couple of my other friends also were struggling with not being able to focus, and just they kind of had some of the symptoms too. So I was able to actually talk to them and be like, oh, like I was just diagnosed with ADHD. And one of my best friends ended up also being diagnosed with ADHD. She had a little bit different symptoms, but it was mostly the same with just she was always very good in school and always like very talkative with everybody. But she really struggled as well. And I thought it was nice that we could kind of go through it together and be, kind of our support people. Negatively, it's just sometimes I do feel like I'm working 2 times as hard as everybody else. And I feel like when I do have a lot going on, which senior year has been a lot with a lot of things going on, that sometimes I get a little bit too overwhelmed because I feel like I need to sit down and do this for one class and then do this for one club and then go do this for another hour. And like it's all stuff that I want to do and I'm able to do, but it seems to take extra time, which can be really unfortunate, especially when I do have a lot to do. So then that can go into my sleep or everything. But I think the biggest like negative that I've had for a long time was the sleep aspect because I couldn't seem to turn my head off. Like my thoughts just kept going and going. Like I would be like, okay, like I'm supposed to sleep now, be in my bed, be all like ready for bed. And my mind would just be like, you need to study for this test tomorrow. You need to do this. Or it wouldn't even be like an anxiety thing. It would just be my mind would just keep coming up with thoughts, and the medication did help that for a while, which was really nice. So yeah, there's been negatives and positives.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for sharing. I think you really brought it to life for me. And yeah, so impressed with everything you're doing. And by the way, I've heard you have a test just after this panel. So yeah, also extremely impressive that you're able to do this panel and then going back to your school life. So yeah, thank you so much for joining and sharing your experience. I'm going to hand it over back to Ariana, and we'll hear with her from Amy.
Thanks, Nina, and thanks, Natalie. Your perspective is really inspiring to many people. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the take and the answers of Emily. Emily does research in a very interesting field and has a very interesting perspective. So I really encourage everyone to read her papers. Are really interesting. And our first question for you, Emily, is are females with ADHD underrepresented in research and clinical settings, and why? And this is a very important question for this panel, as well as for the Datathon competition that we had. Datathon is a word that I can never say. So maybe we can call it competition that we have, but as well as for society, I would say.
Yeah. So the short answer is yes. The longer answer is that women and girls are underrepresented in most areas of biomedical research, neuroscience research in general. And it's often been treated that like boys or males are like the default, and then women like are just should be similar to that, even if it's not the case. And for ADHD in particular, in addition to neurodevelopmental disorders generally, it was often thought that ADHD was a disorder that only applied to boys and that only applied in childhood. And so historically, how the diagnostic criteria were developed, how studies were conducted, and who participated was with that kind of male-centric focus in mind. And it really wasn't until recent decades that people realized that, number one, girls can have ADHD. Number two, that like this doesn't stop when you turn 18. A lot of people with the disorder are continuing to have challenges across the lifespan. And so I think number one is just this clinical and scientific insistence on ADHD being like a boy's disorder. I think second, there's a lot of things that Rebecca mentioned in terms of like it being challenging to get girls and women diagnosed. So in childhood, the rates of diagnosis in boys is about 2 to 2.5 times greater than more than that in girls, whereas once you reach adulthood, it's closer to 1.5 to 1, because girls or women might be getting diagnosed, but are getting diagnosed later. And Rebecca discussed a couple of the challenges that are related to this. So girls showing more inattentive symptoms, so disorganization, difficulty focusing, which are not necessarily disruptive in a classroom. They don't show as many kind of disruptive behavioral disorders. So they're not calling out, interrupting others, hitting other people, which for a teacher with 30 kids in your class is something that's really, you're going to latch onto like, okay, like I think that this kid might need to get an assessment. At times, like the same behaviors that a girl or a boy is displaying might be viewed by teachers or parents as like, this is ADHD for the boy, but not view those same behaviors from an ADHD lens in the girl. And then also, as I think Rebecca mentioned, I think Natalie had kind of lived experience with this, girls may show a lot of compensatory behaviors. So doing a lot of kind of structuring their time or getting a lot of support from others, or certain things like school being really motivating. So they're able to kind of tap into that anxiety or that motivation to focus, even though it's taking so much more effort and so much more time than their peers. And so for a lot of those reasons, it can reduce the likelihood that ADHD is diagnosed early in girls. Also, a lot of research has been focused on clinic-referred samples. So these are samples where people are going out actively seeking kind of an assessment or clinical services because they're having challenges or something is wrong, and they're looking for answers. Whereas in community-based samples, where you're basically just like, please bring your kids to this study so we can see what's up, the rates of diagnosis are much more similar because you as a clinician or you as a researcher are going out and giving these kids all of these assessments. You're seeing what are the levels of the symptoms, where they're reporting. And so you're going to be capturing some kids where, similar to what Natalie was mentioning, like might not be at the level that's impairing in a classroom, even though they're showing it's taking a lot of effort to get to that same place that other kids might be without as much effort. So in summary, like the focus on these clinic-referred samples, these difficulties with girls getting a diagnosis earlier in life, as well as just kind of bias in the science more generally.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's one aspect that you mentioned that also Rebecca mentioned, and also, you know, was part of this conversation more in general, and also Natalie mentioned, is the aspect of the importance of the community and discussing this and, you know, talking about that and having people that listen to you as well as understand what you're going through. So I think that this is something that I'm, you know, picking up from this conversation, and I really like it. So yeah, I just wanted to mention this because you also mentioned that it was like a thread throughout this conversation. I know that you have some research as well across the lifespan, not just for girls and boys, but also for women and men. So I wonder, how does ADHD affect females and males in adolescence and adulthood?
Yeah. So just like generally for both girls and boys, we tend to see that these symptoms of inattention, so like forgetfulness, difficulty with organization, those tend to remain relatively constant across time. So a kid with inattention, though there's some variability, is likely to also have some challenges with inattention as an adult. Whereas these manifestations of impulsivity or hyperactivity, so getting up out of your seat, interrupting others, fidgeting all the time, like those might, though not for everyone, those tend to decline over time. And that's true in both boys and girls. Girls tend to especially those who have challenges with both inattention and hyperactivity, often show or tend to have higher rates of challenges with anxiety and with depression, whereas boys often are more showing challenges with kind of behavioral problems or substance use or things like that. Some of my work has particularly focused on adolescent development, specifically with an eye towards girls with ADHD. So specifically, adolescence and puberty can be really tough for everyone. There's a lot of changes happening both socially as well as biologically and hormonally. And we, I guess, at a field had been operating under the assumption that like kids with ADHD or kids with neurodevelopmental disorders generally are kind of experiencing this transition the same as everyone else. And I don't think that's necessarily a fair assumption to make, given that there are these additional pre-existing challenges with, for instance, for some kids with ADHD, kind of self-control, self-motivation, some of these social or emotional challenges. And so some of my work look at just like the timing of puberty. So we can't intervene if we don't know like when things are happening. And it had just been operating under the assumption that puberty was happening at the same time for kids with ADHD relative to kids without, though there was some, for instance, research in the autism space that found that girls with autism were developing physically earlier than peers without, even though there was no differences in boys. So my work found that girls with ADHD are showing a similar timing of the development of puberty as their peers without the disorder. I don't necessarily think that's surprising, and I still think it's important to note that like their bodies are maturing at the same rate and at the same time, and they need to be receiving similar kind of information and knowledge about their changing bodies and about these shifting like societal expectations based on how they look. Into adulthood, there's for everyone a lot more independence, autonomy, as well as kind of expectations placed on you to kind of self-manage your life, and for people with ADHD to also self-manage your symptoms and your medication. And that transition can be really challenging for a lot of folks. So specifically, some of my qualitative work looks at young adult women with ADHD and how they perceive their functioning, their lives, their symptoms in a variety of domains. And a lot of these women think that they still have ADHD. They were diagnosed with ADHD as children, and they say that it continues to influence them in a lot of different ways. Some view it as having kind of like an emotional consequences in terms of like anger or anxiety, whereas other people mainly describe kind of this distraction, difficulty focusing, kind of being all over the place or being scatterbrained. And despite this, very few of these same women report having strategies or engaging in active strategies to cope with their ADHD. So they're reporting, yes, I still have these symptoms, and many of them are not kind of taking medication, seeing a therapist to provide strategies. Some people are using, and this has been found in the male literature as well, some people are using illicit substances, which they're viewing as helping their ADHD, for instance, marijuana, which the literature has shown like doesn't actually do that. But so kind of there's disconnect between these women are continuing to struggle with the symptoms and at the same time reporting that often they're not kind of engaging in these active strategies to cope. And for some of them, they reported kind of difficulty accessing medication or providers. For others of them, it sounded like they had negative experiences with medication in childhood, or they feel that they don't need it or don't want it. And similarly, in the qualitative literature more generally, so not just my own work, has found that a lot of like college students with ADHD, though some view medication and accommodations as really critical, really important for their success. Other people didn't even know that that was an option, or they don't want to be viewed as needing drugs, or they view it as or they view taking this additional support as like cheating or as unnecessary. And so at times this is disconnect between the services that would be helpful and knowledge or willingness to engage with those services. And then just in general, a lot of women with ADHD on average, seem to be satisfied with their lives or have really clear goals or for the future and confidence that they could meet them. Though for many, like mental health continued to be a challenge, often describing other co-occurring difficulties with anxiety or depression, among other challenges. And for many, though some had really strong social bonds, both with their family and with their friends, which they described as being really supportive and really helpful, really critical, other people described kind of a lack of close friendships or a lack of people who they could lean on for support. And so overall, in summary, both qualitatively and quantitatively, both boys and girls with ADHD often are seeing continued symptoms into adulthood, though how it might actually present might differ based on the person. And some people might see lessening symptoms, some people might, with kind of the additional kind of independence or the lack of structure with this transition to young adulthood and college, see increasing impairment, even if these symptoms have been here all along. I think that's the gist.
Yeah, thanks. You really have an interesting and fascinating research path. I was saying that at the beginning, so I really learned a lot through reading your papers and hearing your answers to these questions. And I'm sure there are a lot of people in the audience that are fascinated as well by your career. So I wonder whether there is any tips or any advice that you can give to students or early career people that are interested in following your same path.
I would say just like approach things with openness and curiosity. So as an undergrad, I did research in an adolescent development lab, which I really liked and I thought was really valuable. And like I was learning about kind of this emotion regulation, these social challenges. And I was connecting like what I was learning like to ADHD about what I learned in class. And I was like reading papers like on the side and asking questions, connecting it. And like ADHD was not what my undergrad lab did. And I had a really supportive mentor who really encouraged me to go with this like developing passion and this developing interest, even though it wasn't kind of her main area of focus. And so I think finding mentors who can help kind of guide you and who support you and champion you, I think is really helpful. I think that having and developing kind of like statistical or data science skills is incredibly helpful. So in psychology, having those skills really allows you to, number one, like when you're reading paper, see like, did they do a good job? Does this not make sense? What does this paper mean? And then also it gives you the tools to really answer the types of questions that you're interested in using the data that's available. And I think that it's just a critical skill in psychology and one that like every single PhD student I know, like faculty members, like it's these data science and these data analysis skills are just so critical. And so I would say that like, if y'all are here, already doing great on that, which is something helpful to develop. And I would say that like also just getting involved in research, ideally in psychology, but also like in between undergrad and grad school, I was doing research at the National Institutes of Health studying like functional outcomes in patients with sclerotic chronic graft-versus-host disease, which is not related to ADHD. And I was still gaining a lot of really valuable kind of research skills, connections. They had a lot of professional development opportunities. At that time, I already knew what I was interested in researching. So I did not use that time to like figure out, okay, like this is the area that I want to study for graduate school, which I think is a really valuable thing for a lot of people to do in that time between undergrad and grad school. And I still think that that research opportunity was helpful. So I would say that like if your only opportunity to engage in research is something that might not be like super related to what you think you're interested in, I would say that like, I mean, don't make yourself like miserable or anything. I would say that it can still be valuable to kind of engage with those opportunities and see if there's a way that like you can connect to something you're interested in, or you can be gaining valuable skills that you can then apply to something that you're really passionate about.
Yeah, these are great tips. Thank you so much, Emily. So for the last part of our panel discussion, I'll pass it on to Amy and Tim.
Great. Thank you so much. This discussion has been fantastic, by the way. And I want to turn gears a little bit and talk about brain imaging. So Tim, can you tell us about what kind of information brain imaging gives us and discuss some of the discoveries that brain imaging has given us about ADHD?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's not just a simple question, that one, but neuroimaging encompasses a range of different techniques. There's techniques that map into function. There's the ones that look at more different aspects of structure of the brain, and they all have sort of different advantages and limitations. I'll speak more to MRI or magnetic resonance imaging, but even within MRI, there are a number of different sequences or types of photos that we can take to glean information around, the cortical structure of the brain, the different types of tissue and volumes and thicknesses of different regions. We can also map the white matter that connects parts of the brain and helps it work together as a functional network. And then we can also look at function as well, and either when someone is doing a particular cognitive or task, or just at rest as well. So, over a couple of decades now of work in this space, early days really tried to locate a single kind of part of the brain maybe that, might be responsible for the disorder, but nothing really emerged as a key area in itself. There was, areas, whether it was structurally or functionally, that were being associated in very different parts of the brain across the brain. And so, we've started to realize that perhaps this is, not just a particular part of the brain, but maybe a network of brain regions and how that brain operates as a network. And so that's really where the research has developed. But there's still a lot of heterogeneity or mixed findings in the findings that are out there. But ADHD is, presents very differently too. It has a difference in the symptoms. There's different co-occurrences. Obviously, differences between males and females, which we'll come back to. But just jumping back to think, well, why would we be doing imaging work? One option might be that, is there a way that this can be used to help in the clinical assessment or diagnosis? And I'll come back to that, but it probably hasn't really made huge leaps there. But where it has made a lot of leaps forward is in trying to understand the neurobiology underlying the disorder, or what are the mechanisms for particular symptoms or particular, cognitive performance, or, how does this change when someone's on a particular intervention or a medication? And gaining that understanding of how that brain works gives us much better insight into being able to understand what's going on, but also to develop other interventions going forward.
Great. Yeah, so can you tell us about specifically the differences between boys and girls that you've identified potentially with any kind of imaging?
To be honest, it hasn't revealed too much. And the findings have been very mixed. But loosely, the findings do kind of reflect a point that Rebecca was making before about, slightly more inattentive, symptoms in girls and hyperactive symptoms in boys. The respective brain areas tend to be reflected a little loosely in that. But females have been grossly represented in the imaging data. And to some extent, early on, that was understandable. Neuroimaging is very expensive. And as I mentioned, that all of this different heterogeneity in ADHD, we tried to, because you only had a small group, scientists would try and get rid of any different, different things that would add to that variability. And so often girls not being very represented clinically, they were also excluded. But, as we've progressed, girls have been included in these imaging studies more and more. And there are also studies in purely girls. But this is an area where there is huge scope for knowledge gain. to elaborate, I guess, on some of the points that Emily was talking about before, across adolescence, there is obviously huge hormonal events that are happening, and we don't really think about how much that shapes our brain, but we've got huge hormone receptors in our brain that shape the development of different brain structures. And if you look at the parts of the brain that do have the highest density of hormone receptors, these are in key parts of the brain, like the thalamus, the nucleus accumbens, prefrontal cortex, and cerebellum, limbic regions. These regions that not only are involved in key neurotransmitter pathways such as dopamine, but they're also areas that have consistently come up to being associated with ADHD. And so not only across adolescence and puberty, that's not the only hormonal event in our lifespan. Particularly for girls, there is other key hormonal events, obviously, throughout their lifespan, with pregnancy, menopause, and obviously the menstrual cycle as well. And so that, anecdotally, there's a lot of information coming from females that they feel that their symptoms or how they present with their ADHD changes across the menstrual cycle, or they might, they find the medication might be less effective at different times of that menstrual cycle. And so this is an area that is really needing some future work, and there is absolutely no research yet looking at this and how it's affecting the brain, or the impact of like hormonal contraceptives as well.
Thank you for saying that, because I think that this is one of the big motivations for the Women's Brain Health Initiative. It's really focusing on these events that are specific to women's bodies. So looking at how menstrual cycles impact brain health, which is one of the sort of first data sets to come out from Emily Jacobs, which is our director of WBHI. So looking at this dense sampling over time and how people's brains fluctuate when hormones fluctuate, I think is really key to understanding women's brain health. We also have a lot of studies in looking at serial imaging in pregnancy. So that's another thing that we really have focused on in the last year or so, a couple of years, is analyzing sort of these huge changes that occur in pregnancy. And it sort of potentially mirrors what happens in adolescence. So looking at these things as a whole and how all of these things contribute, and the hormone fluctuations contribute to brain activity or structure, I think will help us understand more about things like ADHD specifically, where you do have this impact of hormones on brain activity that could potentially interfere or contribute to ADHD symptomology. So taking that sort of thread, how can brain imaging potentially help us care for individuals with ADHD?
Yeah, so I guess coming back to the point I was making before about, can it be used in the clinical setting to aid in diagnosis? At the moment, in that research setting, it's not just a single brain scan from one individual that we're using. We're collating a pattern of changes or differences that are occurring across a big group of individuals, and trying to find out where there's some consistency. But as I've noted, with such heterogeneity, that kind of gets washed away out of those big group findings. And so this is not unique to ADHD, but sort of broadly across psychiatry. It's really not currently at the state where you could stick a single individual in the scanner and go, yeah, they've got that diagnosis. Particularly with something like ADHD as well, where it's a spectrum of behaviors that do present across the population, and there's a lot of sub-threshold ADHD, and so really where a clinical diagnosis cutoff is based more on the impact and impairment that it's having on an individual's life across different settings. So there are studies that have tried to use brain imaging to do a predictor diagnosis, for example. Thinking about it, they use this terms of it's got to be sensitive to that disorder, but also specific. So, you need to be able to accurately predict an individual with a disorder has the disorder, but also an individual without the disorder does not have that disorder. And historically, studies that try to do that, that predictive accuracy is not that high across psychiatry. But I think we're in a really exciting space because with a lot of the advancements in things like machine learning, it's picking up a lot of things that aren't necessarily there that we pick up by eye. And as we move on, that predictive accuracy is getting higher and higher and higher. So I think it's an exciting future ahead.
Well, I fully agree. So obviously my career has been built on this type of approach, but I think the thing that you mentioned about the heterogeneity and the heterogeneity in symptomology potentially could be mirrored with heterogeneity in the brain imaging, right? So that may be why we don't find this, smoking gun of this is the thing that is causing ADHD, or this, if this person has this, that they're diagnosed with ADHD, right? And I think that there's a lot of things we can learn from let's say studies in depression that are looking at subgroups of patients within depression that have a particular type of symptomology, and also they have a particular type of brain imaging presentation. And depending on which subgroup you're in, you might have a better chance at responding to a particular treatment. So that gets back to what Natalie was talking about, where she says there's this, long journey of how to figure out what is optimal for her, right? So this idea of personalized medicine, where you might be able to take a picture of a person's brain and also their symptom sort of cadre of symptoms and be able to say that this person is going to benefit most from this particular type of therapy. So I think that that is something that could be potentially a future development. Yeah. So with that,
ultimately, that's where we want to get to.
yes, exactly. Yeah, that is the overall goal. All right. And I think we have one final question. I think Nina will take this one. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. And by the way, thank you to all of our panelists. I've learned so much, and I think we're very fortunate to have like different experts, like both clinicians, researchers, and also an individual with ADHD. It's been extremely informative. I have one last question, and then we'll open to the questions on YouTube. So if you're following us on YouTube, please post your questions in the comments. We'll find them there. But before we get to your questions, one more question for all of the panelists. How do you all think that discussing ADHD, like we're doing here today, but also conducting research on ADHD, like some of you are doing, can help both one, diagnose ADHD better, or understand ADHD better in girls and women? And Rebecca, maybe if you want to
Yes.
start.
I can start out, and I just want to echo that it's been fascinating hearing everybody's answers, and I've learned so much just from listening to you. So I think that, the main reason that it's important to further our research in this area is just also to raise awareness and improve education of the community, because through doing that, we can really try to detect ADHD earlier and more accurately. And unfortunately, being in the position of, seeing so many people who are getting diagnosed later in their development, we have learned the hard way how important early diagnosis can be, because what starts out as just ADHD, unfortunately, especially untreated ADHD, puts you at risk for so many other mental health issues. And we see kids who are struggling with, low self-esteem, low motivation, giving up at school, just, this feeling of just kind of like low self-efficacy that can really lead to anxiety and depression. And what started off as something that's, relatively straightforward to treat as far as mental health disorders go, the medication is really effective. We know how to support kids in school for ADHD, then becomes something that's, so much more complicated and entrenched. And so, I think understanding, different presentations and the heterogeneity and, how girls may be presenting differently, and even, on the clinician side of really, understanding that, addressing, different biases that we may have in, in diagnosis, understanding, biases that are inherent in our, in our diagnostic criteria, in our research, as Emily mentioned, and, then bring that really to the community level, I think can make a really big difference.
Thank you for that. Does someone else has an answer to that question?
I think that probably the biggest thing for me for getting kind of this kind of out there and getting the research out there is more just helping kids like me, like those in elementary school, to not only just get to like the kids, but the parents. Because I feel like my journey, although it was really long, I feel like if, you know, my parents kind of knew what ADHD looked like in girls, then they probably would have figured it out, because as soon as my mom kind of looked that up and kind of went down the rabbit hole of ADHD in girls, she kind of realized, oh, like this has been here since the beginning. So I feel like just kind of shortening that time and getting girls like the help that they need so that they don't have to feel like they're doing extra hard. Because I think my biggest issue was I ended up getting anxiety because I felt like I had to work so hard to get things done, and grades were such a big deal for me that if we can kind of see those signs and figure out how to like help girls early on, then they don't have to go through a long process of trying to figure out what's going to help them best.
Thank you.
I'll jump in as well. So I think, you know, reflecting on some major events that have happened in Australia recently in this space, we've had the first clinical guidelines released for ADHD. We've had a Senate inquiry into treatment of ADHD. And I've also recently been involved in a Delphi study looking at what are research priorities for professionals working with people with ADHD. And across all of these, you know, real key issues that have come out of it is understanding what's happening with girls and women with ADHD and how best to support them. And so, you know, getting these conversations started and getting people thinking about it, it helps, you know, those people with lived experience understand and feel represented. It helps, as Natalie was saying, that parents, teachers, and even clinicians just be a little bit more forefront of mind that this is an issue for girls and women and might be something that they jump to a bit quicker than they would otherwise. But also in terms of priorities for research funding bodies as well. And so, you know, I really think that if it gets highlighted as a priority area, then, you know, research funding can be directed and prioritized to these areas as well.
Thank you. Emily, do you have an answer too?
Yeah, I would just say, like, echoing what others have said, like, it's not until the last like couple of decades that people even were like, oh, girls and women, like girls and women with ADHD is even like a thing. And so I think that increasing just general awareness of what ADHD looks like, of how it might look in girls, and the challenges faced by girls and women with ADHD will hopefully help to, number one, kind of reduce the stigma of families and of individuals and women with ADHD who might feel like, oh, like I'm the only woman with ADHD, like this is just like a boys thing. And two, like might help families, like Natalie, you mentioned, like recognize that, oh, what my kid is struggling with might not just be anxiety, might also be ADHD. And I think also just science in general needs to go away from using males as the default for our understanding of cognitive and behavioral phenomena, and that ADHD and neurodevelopmental disorders in general are an area that have been really male dominated thus far, and that we really don't understand well enough in girls and women, especially in areas that are kind of specific to girls and women. So like hormonal changes with the menstrual cycle or with menopause or with pregnancy. And those are like female specific concerns that we just don't know enough yet, which is really unfortunate because these are really important hormonal life transitions for all women, and therefore women with ADHD are going through these transitions. And the fact that we can't even like tell people like this is what tends to happen is unfortunate.
Just
Yeah, I
to,
agree.
sorry, just the one thing I wanted to point out is it was only in 2016 that the NIH required that grants proposals considered sex as a biological variable. So we're in like the very early stages of really understanding how events in a female's life impact brain health. And I think that everyone listening should maybe get excited about it. It's not going away, despite what you may have heard. And it will still be considered in NIH proposals. I confirmed that with my SRO today. So it is still a thing that will be considered in grant proposals moving forward. And I think it's an important thing that I think everyone can get behind when we hear the statistics about the understudied nature of women's reproductive and hormonal shifts that happen throughout the life and how understudied they are. It impacts 50% of the population. It's not some small, part of the population that is being affected by these things. And the fact that we don't really know much about that is something that I think is low-hanging fruit for future research. So everyone out there, get excited about doing that.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. That was very, very powerful. And yeah, women are not just little men, and their biology, and especially in the context of ADHD, merits our attention, deserves our attention. So it's time for medicine and medical research to start paying attention. Thank you all to the panelists. Now we have some questions from the audience on YouTube. And so if you are following us on YouTube, please post your questions there. We're going to pick them up. I'm going to start with the first question, which is building on what Natalie mentioned on how she was diagnosed just after she realized that during COVID, her focusing capabilities were impaired. The question is, or anybody who wants to answer, were there more adults who acknowledged that they had been living with ADHD and they acknowledged that during the pandemic because their work structure was gone with working from home? Does any one of you know if more adults have been diagnosed with ADHD during the pandemic?
So my understanding is that rates of ADHD diagnosis in adults, as well as taking medication for ADHD, have increased in recent years. I've heard kind of anecdotally from people who mentioned that even like late teens, similar to Natalie, where they were doing okay in school, and then it got to the point where they had to be on their computer at home, and then all the coping strategies just kind of broke down. So I've heard anecdotal stories about that. I don't know, others might know about like a causal, like pandemic work structure directly causing kind of some increased diagnosis. I think what also might be playing a role is I know that with social media, there's a lot more discussion of some of these mental health challenges. And so people might be more aware and seeking out a diagnosis. We also don't know kind of the quality of the diagnostic process that they're going through. So if it's like a 15-minute conversation with a pediatrician or a general practitioner, or if they're going through a full assessment. But I know that there is an increase in kind of the rates of like stimulant medication, which is used to treat ADHD in adults, as well as my understanding an increase in ADHD diagnosis in adults overall.
Great, thank you. Does anyone have any other comments for that question before we move on to the next one? Okay, the next one is, does there appear to be an overlap between autism and ADHD in females? So I will kick it off by saying I do know one similarity between autism and ADHD, which is that females tend to have a lower rate of diagnosis, and it might be because of the compensatory mechanisms that exist for females that might not be as strong in males. And so, yeah, that's one of the overlaps I know of. I'm not sure about like neurobiological overlaps or symptomology overlaps, if anyone wants to.
So I can speak a little bit to the symptomology overlaps, just in the difference in presentations. And I think there's a lot of research being done in how autism presents very differently in girls. And we might have to, rethink our criteria and some of the questions that we're asking that are more geared towards the typical male presentation of autism. So, for example, we know that girls are more likely to have some good like compensatory pro-social behaviors and can kind of like mask some of the typical social communication deficits in autism, but when you start looking at more subtle signs of, difficulties with social relationships, you start to see a pattern that really is consistent with autism. And then we also see big differences in the restricted and repetitive behavior patterns, and which restricted and repetitive behaviors are more present in males versus females. So we'll see in males that they're more likely to have some of those like restricted interests that are not as common actually in females with autism, but females in autism will show different restricted and repetitive behaviors. They're just as likely to have some of the sensory difficulties, just as likely to have some of the more like rigid adherence to routines. So just understanding the different presentations and how it might not be what we think of classically is very similar to the conversation that we had about ADHD.
I would say just generally, I think this is true for both boys and girls. The rates of autism as well as other neurodevelopmental disorders is higher in folks with ADHD than it is in the general population. So that doesn't speak to specific symptoms, but individuals with ADHD are more likely to have autism or other learning challenges compared to the general population.
Good. Okay. If anybody else wants to interject, please do. If not, we can move to the next question. This is a good one. Are continued symptoms seen in adulthood also more complicated for women due to major hormonal shifts with pregnancy, postpartum, and perimenopause or menopause? Rebecca, I see you nodding. Do you have a...
I mean, that would just make a lot of sense to me, but I work mostly with children, but I'm very interested to hear what they have to say.
Tim?
Yeah, so this comes back to a point I was making before that there is a lot of anecdotal evidence that this is certainly the case, and I know of a few sort of qualitative focus group type research that have started to come out that revealing these, but really this is identified now as a real key area that needs to be researched. I don't think there is the evidence base there in research as it currently exists, but that's what people with lived experience and clinicians are telling us as well.
So does anyone know, I actually don't know this, do you have to go off of the ADHD medication when you're pregnant? Is that do you know if that's I don't know if it's a contraindication or...
I don't know, to be honest, sorry.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I know a lot of neuropsychiatric medications that it kind of varies, right? So maybe they have to weigh the negative impact on the mother versus potential harm for the baby. So I know that that's often a decision that is tough to make. Yeah.
That's a good tie to a question that's in the chat right now, which is, are the same medications used for males and females in ADHD? Does someone knows that?
Yes, so the same medications are typically used for males and females. So most are stimulants, which are, I think, selective dopamine reuptake inhibitors. So I think they're some form of like methylphenidate. I think Adderall, Vyvanse, Concerta, Ritalin are common like brand names for those, not advertising for any of them, just stating. And so my understanding is that the same medications are typically used for males and females. I think it is not standard practice for like there to be different like doses of medication across like the menstrual cycle, for instance. Though I know that Michelle Martel and her research team at the University of Kentucky does do some work or has done some recent work looking at changes in executive functioning and ADHD symptoms across the menstrual cycle. But currently, yes, they are using the same medications, and that medication dosage is not shifting across the menstrual cycle, for instance.
I think that, I've also seen some research that in addition to the underdiagnosis of ADHD in females, they're also, even once females are diagnosed, they're actually less likely to be prescribed medication, even when you account for their symptom severity. So what I think, and think that, there's also research to show that they're more likely to be prescribed with medication for anxiety or depression. So, I think that just goes back to the education piece of really having that awareness of being able to detect ADHD in females also, and treating it the same way with the medication that we know, is just as effective for females.
I just as building off of that, have there been any studies that have looked at the efficacy of the different types of medication in terms of male and female, or not yet? Does anyone know of any?
So I can't speak to that exactly, but what we do know clinically is that one of the main side effects of stimulant medications is that there can be an increase in anxiety as a side effect. So when there's comorbid anxiety, we're also much more careful in recommending medication. And, there are non-stimulant options that can be considered. So I would imagine that that's also a factor that plays in for medication for women when, thinking about the higher rates of, comorbid anxiety and depression.
If nobody has anything else to say about this, I wanted to mention the next question because it's something that is quite exciting to me as well, which is for non-students like me, how can I continue to be involved and contribute to it, actual analysis, coding in the data science space? So I just came back actually from the Women Data Science conference in Cambridge, where I feel very empowered and very excited about this space where you don't need to be part of academia or part of industry, but you can meet people that do work in data science and really people that are inspiring for their work. So joining spaces where you can meet people that can show what they do and how they work in data science is one great opportunity. I'm not a panelist, but I'm going to just mention something about this because I'm just excited. As well as participating in data science competition, for instance, hosted by Kaggle. This is a great opportunity as well to being, part of the not only the data science community, but also being able to participate in the challenge as in terms of the domain. So, for instance, learning about, in this case, ADHD, or learning about other topics that are relevant in neuroscience. So I think that this is a great opportunity as well. I just wanted to ask the panelists though whether they know of opportunities where people can get involved in data science, especially in this space.
And I think one of the great things about the Healthy Brain Network where we work is that, anyone could really you look at our data. If you sign a data user agreement from our website, you can look, ask questions about any of the, social, emotional, behavioral, cognitive, brain scan data that we have. So if you come in with a question and an understanding of data science, then the data is there for you, which is a great opportunity.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like using, being part of the open science community and open science movement is a great starting point to be able to get the data and analyze the data and learn from the data. Yeah, so that's definitely a helpful way to start, working in data science.
Mm-hmm.
I would say also, I can't speak for everyone, but I think that data science skills and data analysis and statistical skills are a really valuable and attractive skill set for researchers or research assistants to have. And so I would say that if there's an area that you're interested in, you can reach out to people who study that, see if they need a research assistant, or if you could volunteer, provide support. They might not always answer because inboxes get very full. At the same time, if you don't ask, the answer is no. So I would say if that's something you're really passionate about and really interested in pursuing further, that's definitely a really valuable skill set to have, and reaching out to people who are looking at the type of data and the type of questions that you're interested in. Again, I don't know, but could have opportunities for you to contribute to kind of the data analysis, data science side of some of their projects.
And just wanted to add that also beyond the data that is often open, so you have repository like Open Neuro from our collaborator Russell Boldrack at Stanford, and also, of course, the data from the Annes Bowers Women's Brain Health Initiative that is fully open source. So you have a lot of open source data repository, but you also have a lot of open source code. So there are a lot of packages in Python that have very good tutorials to get you started. So NiLearn is one that you can use for neuroimaging, for example, and I know they have great tutorials. But yeah, go on GitHub, look for the notebooks and tutorial section, participate in the Which Data Challenge, and you'll be off to a great start.
Yeah, and there are a lot of people that build this community and share their resources. So just starting with what people already shared and learning through that, I think that it's great. It's like, you know, we are not starting. We are really in the middle of this open science movement. So there is a lot that is already available to start working, you know, start learning about data science, but as well as contributing to that.
And for those of you who are on the other side and have expertise in like neuroscience or perhaps ADHD or psychology or something like that, and you want to learn data science, there are a lot of massive online courses that you can take. If it's not something that you can get at your university, you could potentially do this on your own. And sort of ChatGPT and the rise of Copilot has really helped us people who don't know how to code to learn how to code. And there's a lot of sort of advances in AI on the coding side that can help someone who is a novice in coding to learn how to do that. So yeah. I think there's one more question here, or a couple, yeah, one more question. How can we improve the accuracy and accessibility of ADHD diagnostic measures for girls while ensuring that assessments and interventions are respectful of cultural beliefs and practices? So this one could potentially be for Rebecca or Emily or Ariana.
Yeah, I think, you know, taking into account, you know, people's cultural beliefs and practices is really important. And, you know, it's something that that we deal with a lot, especially, you know, first of all, just, you know, different cultural attitudes towards diagnosis to begin with and the stigma that comes along with that, and really, you know, addressing that on a, you know, individual family basis. And then also looking at, you know, different attitudes towards different interventions like medications, and, you know, really being open as clinicians to, you know, helping families find support in a way that, you know, aligns with their values and their practices. So I think that, you know, it's important to have different options for treatments, and it's not a one size fits all approach for everyone. So I think that, you know, that's why it's important to get a really comprehensive evaluation and not just kind of like zoom in on, okay, these are the, you know, 18 symptoms of ADHD. If you have them, then you have them. If not, not. We really need to look at the bigger picture, understand their educational context, understand, you know, the rest of their mental health and their, you know, their family expectations and their school expectations. And those are all important factors in making the diagnosis.
And I think it is a really challenging trade-off between the comprehensiveness of the assessment and the diagnosis and accessibility. As Rebecca mentioned, these comprehensive assessments provide really valuable knowledge in terms of the child's overall like cognitive and educational functioning, the accommodations that might be helpful, and they can cost thousands of dollars. Whereas like a 15-minute conversation with your primary care provider might also lead to a diagnosis. However, it's also possible that that 15-minute like conversation doesn't take into account like other kind of environmental factors or comorbid factors that could be contributing to symptoms that look like ADHD. It may not take into account like teachers or when ADHD symptoms began, because as we know, we require, or the diagnostic criteria require symptom onset before age 12. And so there's this kind of balance between this comprehensive, really helpful assessment and accessibility of this maybe like 15-minute assessment in this like primary care context. And it's also like within this primary care context, we don't know like what is the family being told about ADHD? What are they being told that like this this acronym like means or what it means for their kid? You're not able to see like, okay, so like what does ADHD mean to this family or to this culture? How are they interpreting their child's behaviors? And so I think that it is really challenging. I don't know that there's an easy answer between balancing accessibility and comprehensiveness. But I think that like in any context, having really culturally sensitive psychoeducation about what ADHD is and is not, the fact that like parents are not causing ADHD, and they can also implement strategies that can help improve symptoms and improve functioning, as well as why do we recommend medication for some kids? Here are the pros and cons. And so I think that having those sensitive and kind of understanding conversations with parents is really critical.
It's actually a perfect segue because the next question was, are the same medications what other treatments besides medication are options for people with ADHD?
Yeah, so what we typically will recommend is, there's school-based supports, and then there's also interventions that you can do outside of school. And, a lot of the school-based supports fall more in the category of like making different accommodations and modifications to the classroom and to the expectations. So like things like getting extra time on tests, getting a separate location that may be more conducive to performing well, being seated in an optimum place in the classroom. Also thinking about what type of classroom you're in to begin with. So we know that kids with ADHD do really well with structure. And a lot of people are able to, have those skills come more naturally to kind of like structure your environment and organize things. But we know for kids with ADHD, they really need to be taught those skills. So it doesn't just come naturally. They're not just going to start making lists and writing down everything they need to do. And so, so they do well in environments that have a lot of external structure. So like a classroom that may have an extra teacher in it, who is well-versed in special education practices. And then outside of the classroom, there are these executive functioning interventions, which are, also pretty effective in, teaching kids those skills to help learn, how to organize, how to start tasks, how to break tasks down into smaller parts, the things that, may come more easily to other people, but are the areas that kids with ADHD really struggle. So, you may see it called like executive functioning tutoring or organizational skill tutoring. So those are the types of supports people can seek outside the classroom. And, there are many families that want to try those things first. And for some people, it can be effective. And then for other people, after they try those things, then they decide, okay, I think that, my kid is really still struggling, and I would want to explore if medication can be helpful.
There's also some more like parent-oriented interventions like parent management training and behavior parent training, which are typically working more closely with parents to create kind of incentives for odd task or desired behaviors, consequences or like planned ignoring of undesired or off-task or disruptive behaviors. So really focusing on the parent as creating this kind of like home environment, often in collaboration with teachers, that really promote the structure, this organization, and kind of these desired behaviors. And then some adults with ADHD, in some places they have like group therapy or individual like cognitive behavioral therapy that is oriented towards kind of ADHD, which will often focus on like structure or like breaking things down, creating kind of lists and other things to help with some of those executive functioning challenges.
Yeah, and I just want to echo the parent management training. That's a great recommendation. I can't tell you how many families have said that that's been like one of the most effective and supportive and helpful interventions in just learning those specialized strategies for how to structure the environment, and specifically for dealing with like temper outbursts and oppositional behaviors, which are so common in kids with ADHD.
Well, thank you everyone for such an insightful discussion and for all of the audience members for putting your questions in. This has been extremely insightful and engaging. Do any of you have any final comments to make about today's topic before we close out?
I just want to thank everyone for hosting this, everyone who coordinated and planned it, and all the people who presented. I know I learned a lot, and I'm just really excited to see where all this research takes us. And it seems like there's been a lot of exciting advances.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining. Yeah, it's really nice discussion. Thank you.
I would like to echo that, and maybe also for the audience, call to action, since a lot of what the panelists said had something to do with awareness. Like, we need to get the word out about what is ADHD and how differently it presents in girls versus boys. So for you, just talk about what you've learned today to at least 2 people, and maybe, we can get the word out this way.
Absolutely. Any other final comments?
I just want to add that there is also more information about all this topic in our Datathon and our competition. So if anyone is interested in learning more, we have a lot of resources there that we have prepared. So it's just, I hope that we sparked interest and people will go and learn more in the competition itself.
Yeah, on that note, the Datathon will be open for another, I believe, month and a half we have left. So I did put the link in the YouTube chat. If you haven't yet signed up and you're interested in participating, we would be absolutely thrilled to see what you discover, and you can follow the links in the YouTube to participate. All right, well, thank you everyone for just an amazing panel. Thank you, Amy, Ariana, and Nina for hosting. And thank you so much, Rebecca and Tim and Emily and Natalie, who actually had to go take a test right after this. So thank you to all our panelists for all of your just amazing discussion. I think this has been extremely fruitful. So we hope that everyone has learned a lot. Let us know if you have any questions after this. This will also be pinned on the WiDS YouTube channel for you to continue to watch and learn from. So thank you, everyone, and have an excellent rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye.